So I had a lot of um, questions or remarks about sort of the genesis of the program. Where did this all come from? What's it all about? Um, and so I thought, and why don't the second thing was why don't I talk about gratitude as much as I used to? So sort of I think I got to be known as Dr. Gratitude because that's what I talked about so much. And so what I wanted to talk some about tonight is the uses for gratitude, how useful it is, but also the limitations, and tell you a little bit about how this all started. And so back after I finally finished all my training, you know throughout my training I was pretty miserable from through high school and college and medical school and residency and then fellowship. um, there was this level of certain level of misery, right? But I always had something to blame, right? In college I was stressed because I was trying to get into medical school, and especially back in those days, you had to have top notch grades to get in, and if I didn't get in I didn't know what I was going to do, and so became college was very stressful. I had essentially daily tension headaches. I didn't know they were tension headaches at the time. I had all this neck and shoulder pain that went up in my head, and I would get this migrainous component of a tension headache where I actually would be a tension headache, but then it got so bad that I would have nausea and I'd feel terrible. These were regular sort of occurrences. Again, no one told me they were tension headaches. So then once I got into medical school, it was very tough, long hours, and I was miserable then. And I thought it was just because I had to get through medical school. And then on residency was even tougher, and the nights were long and call and all that kind of stuff. And I was maybe more miserable, but again, I had an excuse, right? And then in fellowship, same thing, very strenuous, very arduous tasks, and miserable. And but once I finished that, then I would be happy. And then I finished, and I found a great group in Greensboro, in the LeBauer group, and they treated me like a king from actually before I even started. They were just a great bunch of of people, and I couldn't have asked for more. And yet I still was miserable. In fact, maybe more so. Now I was working really hard. Okay, I was working on average more than 60, 70 hours a week, sometimes 80 or 90 hours a week. And I was working to kind of overcome, now to I didn't know this then, but I was working to cover up that imposter syndrome, that not good enoughness, that one day these guys are going to figure out that I'm not nearly as smart as they think I am. And that was um again, I didn't know this then. And so I had a pattern of fleeing, of leaving, because it was easier to leave before anyone figured out that I didn't know as much as I thought I did. And of course in training you don't have to worry about that, because that's the nice thing about from high school to college to medical school to residency and fellowship, you're moving every 3 to 4 years, basically you're leaving. And then so I when I realized in the mid 90s how absolutely miserable I was, and I saw counselors and all this kind of stuff, and I told you, they said I was depressed and that I needed medicines, I had a chemical imbalance, and all this kind of stuff. Um, Meanwhile, I was sort of trying to sort this whole thing out because it didn't make any sense, right? Because I was quote unquote very successful. In fact, 4 years after I joined that group, they made me the head of the cardiology section of that group, and they again treated me very well. But um, I grew increasingly um, antsy to leave, and then eventually I left and went to Moorhead Hospital in Eden, and started the cardiology program there, and then I was still miserable, and then I must have been my family and the way I was being treated at home and such, and so I left my family, and then at some point I basically had left everything that I could leave, and I was alone, and woke up one morning, in that sort of metaphorical sort of looking in the mirror, and and was more miserable than ever. And the only difference was now I didn't have anything to blame. So now I was essentially working for myself and my, in a, my my own solo group, um, solo practice, I should say, um, and I, I found myself sort of at the bottom of this hole because when I realized I had left everything that I could leave and I was still miserable, then I couldn't blame anyone else. So then it was, well, if there's no one else left to blame and I've left everything I can, there's only one thing left, and to be the cause of my misery, and that's me. And that was a big awakening. And I sort of, as I like to say, found myself at the bottom of this hole. And the hole was very deep, so deep that, I couldn't see, light at the end. And it was narrow, and the walls were very steep, and there didn't seem to be a way out. And there's actually a very fitting song by a guy or a group called The Soul of John Black, and it's called The Hole. And if anyone wants, I can send it to them. But I would listen. I heard that song. I would listen to it over and over because it really described what was going on. And he says in that song, I found myself in the hole. And when I woke up, there was no one there but me. And that was gigantic, right? And so I had to decide, what am I going to do? So I had two choices the way I saw it. I could lay down, cover myself up, get comfortable with whatever it is to make myself comfortable, whether it's alcohol or drugs or antidepressants, whether prescription drugs or whatever, or other addictions, to distract myself and get comfortable at the bottom of this hole and make it sort of comfy and stay there. And that sort of seemed easy. And I think that's what a lot of addiction is about, is trying to cover up that feeling of unworthiness, and that's, let's call it the self-hatred. Let's just call it like it is. The other option didn't seem possible, and that was crawling out of the hole, or crawling up the hole. And the problem with what didn't seem possible is I didn't have any tools, right? I looked down and there was just dirt there. I didn't have any tools to scale the walls, or I didn't have a rope. There was nothing. And so that's why I spent some time, or a lot of time, at the local Barnes and Nobles. I used to say they gave me my own parking spot in the front with my name on it because I was there so much, and I got to know. I'd sit in the self-help section. I got to know every book there, and read many of them, and none of them really helped. Not to say that some of those books aren't very helpful, but for me, they weren't all that helpful. And they all say different things, right? They say you got to let things go, you let it go, and forgive, and don't let that bother you, and I just didn't know how to do any of that. And so, and I started looking at other forms of meditation and other forms of spiritual practice, Buddhism, and I looked at everything, or I looked at a lot, I should say. Maybe I didn't stick with any long enough for any of them to work. But anyway, one day I woke up and I had started the Integrative Cardiology Center, and I had borrowed way, way, way too much money, and basically, couldn't pay the bills. We had some money coming in, but there was so much, so much debt that it became very onerous, and it was just it was very depressing. And anyway, one day I woke up early because I had to get to the office because I had a bunch of bills to pay, but there was no money in the checkbook, but I had to write out these bills or whatever. And um so I woke up early, and I got ready, and I was in a huff, of course, and I had one of those big soft-sided briefcases, and the thing was overfilled, right? Because what I would do is, I would leave the office late, and I would take my stuff home. And so I would pack all the stuff in there, and then I would get home, and I was always too tired to do any work. And so the next morning I would just pick it up, and I was even more depressed because now there was work in there I hadn't gotten done. And every day it got a little more stuffed. Anyway, the thing was big, and it was huge, and it was really heavy because it had all this stuff in there. And I was pissed off, and I was leaving, and I was in a huff going out the garage door, and I opened the garage door, and there's three brick steps going out to the cement floor there. And as I went out in my huff, and this somehow this briefcase kind of got hooked on the door, and I kind of got pulled forward, and I went flying forward, heads over heels, down these 3 brick steps, um, onto the floor. And I was completely startled because it happened so quick, you know. And I remember laying there, and the first thing I realized is that I had no pain. And I figured, oh, I must have died in this fall because I have no pain. I must be in heaven. and and I opened my eyes, and and I said, this is really weird. I never would have thought that heaven looks like the cement floor in my garage. And I said, well, that's because it is the cement floor in my garage. And I said, oh, I see what must have happened. I probably broke my neck, and that's why I don't have any pain. And that is the cement floor of my garage. That's more my luck, right? And so I said, well, let me see, and if I can move my fingers and toes. And I started to move my fingers and toes, and I could move them, and I still didn't have any pain. And I said, well, let me get it, try to get up. And as I tried to get up, as I got up, I realized that I was laying on that briefcase that I hated so much. And I realized at that moment that I had broken my fall. And in that instant, I loved that briefcase. So, and then I got up, and nothing hurt, and I didn't break anything. And I picked up the briefcase, and I said, isn't this weird? I said, I just 15, 20 seconds ago, I hated this briefcase. Now I love this briefcase. And the briefcase hasn't changed. What's changed? I've changed, right? My thoughts have changed. So I had incredible gratitude for this briefcase all of a sudden. And I got in the car, and I was all of a sudden feeling pretty good, which was weird because, again, a minute before I was at the height of my misery. And I put the key in the car, and the car started. And it was a 2000 Dodge Intrepid in it. At that point, it had about 150,000 miles, and it started every day. And I just remember sitting there saying, I love this car. It has everything I want in it. And it's never given me any trouble. I never had 150,000 miles, never been in the shop for a problem, just routine stuff. And I felt gratitude, grateful, and I felt wow, and I felt better. I backed out, and it was a November kind of crisp morning, and as I backed out, and I go out forward out my garage, and it's kind of live in a rural sort of area, and kind of have a long garage, and the Smith River is across the street, and the Smith River makes a bend in front of the house, and in the fall, the sun comes right up over that bend. And the sun was just coming up, and it was absolutely gorgeous. And there was one ray that was shooting through the trees, and it was just a beautiful scene, just a painting kind of scene. And I stopped, and I said, God, that's gorgeous. It's absolutely beautiful. And it's there every morning. It's different every morning, and I never notice it because I'm always in such a hurry. I'm always in such a rush. And I stopped just for 6 or 7 seconds. And I noticed it, and I was grateful for it because it was just such a gorgeous day. And I put the windows down, and you come out of my house, and there's a big hill, and I was driving up the hill. I had the windows down, and it was, like I said, cool, and it was just a beautiful morning. And I was feeling better and better. I was feeling great. I was like on top of the world as I drove. And I remember saying, 5 minutes ago, I was at the height of my misery. Nothing's changed. There's still no money in the checking account, mind you, right? It wasn't like all of a sudden there was $1 million in there or enough money to pay the bills, right? The only thing that had changed was me, my thoughts. That was weird. So I got to the office, which was about a 50-minute drive or so, and I remember sitting in my at my desk, and then I remembered what I had gone there early for because I had these bills to pay. And as I sat there, I thought to myself, well, this is really strange because um, I I don't have money in my checking account to sort of pay these bills at this point. And then all of a sudden, um, this misery started to crawl back up, and it started to overwhelm me again. And again, I sort of said, well, how do I find gratitude, to pay my bills when I don't have the money? And so as I sat there, the first bill um, was the electricity, $1,200, and I had budgeted 600. I didn't know that businesses paid more for electricity than residential, and I started to write that check out, and it just so happened that the week before, the electricity had gone out, and in that building you couldn't open the windows or anything, and it got hot, and it was off for a couple hours. It got very uncomfortable, and if it had stayed off for very much longer, we'd had to leave. And I remember saying, thank goodness for the electricity, because without it, we can't. I couldn't. We can't work. We can't get anything done. None of the. None of them. Nothing works. None of the machines work. The echo machine didn't work. The treadmill. Nothing worked. Right. And I said, I really am grateful for the electricity. And I wrote that check out, and it didn't feel so bad. In fact, it felt pretty good. Mind you, there was still no money in the checking account. The next bill was the phone bill, $600. I budgeted 300. I didn't know that business had paid more for phone service than residential. And again, once the electricity had gone out, the phones had gone out. And I said, without the phones, we can't do any business. Fax machines don't work. We can't get labs done. People can't make appointments. We can't do anything. I really appreciate the phones. I am so grateful. And I wrote that check out. And again, it didn't feel nearly as bad. The next bill was the loan, which was a huge. And I remember writing that out, and I remember thinking, I can't believe the bank had enough faith and trust in me to lend me all this money. I'm so, because without that, I couldn't have started this. I'm so grateful that the bank trusted me with this, with this loan and their money. And I wrote that out. And that felt pretty good. Normally, when I would write the bills, I would go back into my office, and the office, I think, would clear out because all you would hear is like wailing and gnashing of teeth coming out of the office door. And and on this day there was no one there, but even if they were, there was no wailing and gnashing of teeth. So again, it was a choice. The fact there was no money in the checking account wasn't going to change at that moment, but I had a choice of how I was going to perceive this. Now, just so happened that the next day, a lot of checks came in, and there was enough to pay all those bills. Now, that may have been a coincidence. I have no idea, right? But regardless, I felt better at that moment. Now, fast forward a year. It may have been 2 years. I think it was 1 year, but it could have been two. But it was the next fall. It was the next October, November, and I got a phone call from a patient in Hickory, North Carolina, which is about 2 hours from Greensboro. Um, back in those days, I would drive. So I had about a 50 going home with the traffic. It was about an hour drive, and I would make most of my calls from the car. And so I had this note to give her a call. This is a patient I never met, And turns out she had bad heart failure. She had her pump, her what we call ejection fraction, was about 15%. Now, normal ejection fraction is about 60%, 50, 60%. Anything less than 30 is pretty very weak. Anything less than 20 is severely weak. Hers was about 15, and she was on the heart transplant list. And she said that she had been, waiting for a heart transplant for a couple of years, and in fact, it was 3 years, and she was getting sicker, and she could only walk about 2 blocks. She was in the hospital, in the ER, in the hospital every 3 months or so, and the doctors had wanted to put this special kind of pacemaker in because she had this thing called the left bundle branch block that they thought might help. And she was kind of a naturalist. She didn't want anything artificial in her body, and she refused the pacemaker. And she would keep coming back, and they kept on her. The physicians did, and her family did. And anyway, she got pretty sick one day, and she, in a moment of weakness in the hospital, she agreed to this pacemaker. And it had now been in for about 4 months, and ever since they put it in, she said 100 times worse. Before, she could walk a couple blocks. Now she couldn't walk just for a few steps. She was in the ER every 2 to 3 days instead of every 2 to 3 months. She was in heart failure all the time. They had moved her up on the transplant list because she had worsening heart failure. And so she was really miserable. And she asked me, she says, I want this pacemaker out. Can they take it out? And I said, yes. I said, they can take it out. But she was really angry, and she had a lot of resentment toward this pacemaker. And she says, I hate the thing. I want it out. And I said, they can take it out. I said, but in all honesty, I said, from what I hear, I don't think you've got so much anger and resentment toward this pacemaker. I'm not sure that you've allowed it to do its thing. Now, I have no idea where those words came from because they didn't teach me that in medical school. They didn't teach me that in residency training. They didn't teach me that in cardiology fellowship. What does all this anger and resentment have to do with a pacemaker working or not? Right. But on the other hand, it seemed intuitively obvious to me for some reason. And she said, well, she says, I don't know, you're right. She says, I hate the thing. I want it out. And I said, well, you got to find a way to be grateful for the pacemaker. And she sort of started getting angry at me. She says, grateful for it. She says, I hate the thing. How do I don't know how to do that. And I said, okay, well, here's what you do. I said, she goes, I said, your case is very complicated. She goes, a lot going on. I said, you've got to get, I've got to see you. I've got to get your records. I've got to look at all your medications, and I've got to see what's been done. I've got to look at your heart and such. And I said, but in the meantime, I said, what you can do is get a journal, get a nice journal, get a nice pen. And every morning when you wake up, get your, cup of coffee or tea or whatever it is you drink, and sit down and first find 3 things to be grateful for. Anything in your life. Next, write. You can't lie to yourself and say, I love this pacemaker, and you don't. Okay. So write, you know, I hate this pacemaker, and one day they can take it out and I won't need it. But for right now, while it's in, I appreciate this pacemaker. I appreciate the company who makes this pacemaker. I appreciate the fact that they make billions of dollars a year to develop this new technology. I appreciate, the stainless steel that the pacemaker's made out of, the steel in the wires, the technology, the electronics. I appreciate the engineers who thought of making this pacemaker and how to make it. I appreciate the farmers who grew the food to feed the engineers who thought of this pacemaker. You can take it as far as you want. I appreciate the truck drivers and the tires on the trucks who delivered, the supplies to make the pacemakers, who delivered the pacemakers to the hospital when I was getting it. Take it as far as you want. I said, do that, get your records, make an appointment, come see me, and we'll go over things. She says, okay, fine. So I was end of October, beginning of November, and it was 2002, and never saw her at that point. I just forgot about her until about 5 months later. It was March uh, 10th of 2003. I went to the lobby to get the next new patient, and it was her. And I, didn't know her. Of course, I introduced myself, and she introduced herself, and we were walking back, and she says, "Do you remember me?" And I said, "No, I have we met?" Because she was a new patient. She says, "Well, I talked to you back, about 5 months ago on the phone." I said, "Oh, okay. Well, I talked to a lot of people." She says, "I'm the one that had that heart failure and had the pacemaker." And I said, "Oh, yeah, I remember the conversation very well." She says, "Yeah, okay, great." And I said, so we were walking back to the exam room, and I said, "How are you doing?" And she says, "I'm doing great." So the first thing I thought is, oh, she must have gotten her heart transplant. Oh, that's why it took 5 months. She probably got sicker, ended up in the hospital, got on the transplant list, got the transplant, and she's recovered. And this is about the time that it takes, and she's doing great. And so that's probably what happened. So I said, "Oh, did you get your heart transplant?" She said, "Oh no." I said, "Oh, okay." I said, "So did they maybe change your medicine and they find the right medicine?" She says, "No, I'm on the same medicine I was on before." I said, "Okay." I said, "So what changed?" And she said, "Well, I started doing that gratitude journal thing you talked about." I said, "Okay, that's great. And what changed? Like, you know, no, that's the only thing that changed." I said, "Are you sure you didn't get a heart transplant?" And she said, "No, I haven't gotten a heart transplant. As a matter of fact, since I spoke with you and started doing the gratitude journal, I haven't been back in the hospital, and I'm now walking 2 miles a day." And I said, "Hmm, are you sure nothing's changed besides just this gratitude journal?" Because in my mind, gratitude is nice, and it's a great thing if you're having, migraine headaches and irritable bowel and, you know, chronic fatigue and what have you. But this was a big deal. This was like physical. This was heart failure, heart transplant, heart failure, physical. This was the real deal. So physicians would call this an anecdote, right? A story. I call this a case control trial of one, because this was a person where we everything was the same, only one thing changed, and then you measure the effect. So I said, this is pretty weird, but things happen. So I said, let's take a look at your heart. We did an echo, and her ejection fraction was about 30%. Now, 30% is a far cry from normal 50 to 60, but I can tell you it's a whole lot better than 15%. And generally, you don't transplant people with 30% ejection fractions. And I said, that's amazing. And so I saw her back one more time about a year later, and her ejection fraction improved to about 35%. And she was off the transplant list. And she was not hadn't been back in the hospital since. And and then I hadn't seen her. And I was not 2004 or five. I think I saw her the last time. Um, she was doing great. Um, Now, what happened there is, well, first of all, I don't know what happened, but in my mind, it's not that necessarily that gratitude was, caused this miraculous healing or something. Although there was some thought of that because she got put on Christian TV and such, and down in Charlotte, her story was, and it may have been. I'm certainly not going to say that it wasn't, but in my mind, again, I think she let go of all that anger and resentment she had toward the pacemaker and found that appreciation, and she basically allowed the pacemaker to do what it was meant to do, what it was put in for. Because the pacemaker was indicated; it was the right thing to do from just a purely Western medicine physical sort of perspective. Um, so that was interesting, and no coincidence that that evening, when I was getting ready to go to bed, I got this horrible chest pain. That was a very sharp chest pain. That was nothing like what people would say a heart attack was like. So heart attack pain, I had seen a bunch of people with heart attacks, and it's a generally a pressure or a burning or a tightness, a type of sensation. This was sharp, sharp like a knife, like someone was sticking a knife into my chest. And I had had esophageal problems. I had an esophageal erosion and reflux, and I thought, esophageal spasm is pretty sharp and intense, and this sounds more like esophageal spasm. It was very intense, but esophageal spasm sort of spasms for a few minutes and then um, kind of goes away. And this kind of got worse over, I don't know, 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes. This was really strange. And then started to involve my left arm. I said, well, this is too weird. There's a lot going on besides the stress of not being able to pay my bills. In addition, it was March 10th, the night of March 10th. Corporate taxes were due March 15th. I was working on my bookkeeping because I was doing all that myself. Um, I was invited to give a panel, a talk, and then a panel discussion at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, at an integrative medicine conference. That was the following week. There was a lot of stuff going on, and I didn't want to be in the hospital for esophageal spasm. But when my left arm started bothering me, I said that's kind of weird. Anyway, so I went to the emergency room over at Eden at Moorhead Memorial Hospital, which is where I worked, and no, I was feeling bad. I was feeling really bad. So we kind of made it into the ER and plopped onto this bed. And there was one of the ER doctors was a friend of mine, and so everyone comes on over um, and they're getting me set up and doing EKG and all that. And Chuck, the ER doc, brings the EKG over to show me, and this EKG was scary. So this EKG showed things that we call tombstones, and we call them that for a reason. And this was a classic, scariest looking EKG, what you'd find in a textbook. And I said to Chuck, I said, Chuck, you need to get that guy over to Cone because he's having a massive heart attack. And he looked at me confused and he said, Julius, this is your EKG. I honestly thought in my denial that he was showing me someone else's EKG like he did Monday through Friday, when we were working. Hey, what do you think of this EKG? I thought he was showing me someone else's. And I said, and when I saw that, I went, oh boy, so much for the esophageal spasm idea. So a lot of things started to happen very quickly. That's what I wanted to do. And, wanted to go over to Moses Cone Hospital, which was where my partners were, old partners. And anyway, at as I laid there in intense pain, and I remember a lot of very powerful negative emotions running through my head. Right, I was obviously afraid, so there was a lot of fear. There was a lot of anxiety. There was confusion. There was some heart disease in our family, but it really wasn't until older. Nothing. This was 3 weeks before my 43rd birthday, um, and so there was a lot of strong negative emotions. And so I remember laying there, and I remember thinking, well, all this stuff is being done to me at this point, right? And I said, I wonder. Um, I just happened to have seen that lady that day. And I don't know what would have happened had I not seen her. But when I thought of her and I thought how physical that was, right, what was going on with her, I thought to myself, I have a choice. This heart attack is happening, and they're going to do stuff to try to limit the damage and stop the heart attack if they can open the clot up and things like that. And we had made decisions to go to Cone and all that. And they had called CareLink, and it was a bad day. It was snowing. It was cold. I was hoping that CareLink could get there and such. And I had helped set CareLink up when I was working at Cone, so I was pretty grateful for that. CareLink is the mobile intensive care over at Cone, and I said I have a choice. Um, the heart attack's going on. How am I going to perceive this? And I said, it's one thing to sit down when you have heart failure and write in your journal, but it's another thing when you're sitting there having this intense pain and can't get comfortable and trying to be grateful, because I'm certainly not grateful for having a heart attack at this moment, right? Although it wasn't um, one of the best things that ever happened to me, believe it or not. And so I remember at that moment there was a nurse that was trying to start an IV in my hand, and um, and she was uh, a new nurse, like still wet behind the ears. He was just, you could tell she was just out of school, and here she is, a cardiologist. She's trying to start an IV, and she's nervous and all that kind of stuff. And you could tell. And anyway, she tries to stick my hand, and she misses. And I knew that she was going. I was going to get this thrombolytic drug, this blood clot, very powerful blood clot dissolving drug that dissolves all these clots. And I knew that just the fact that she had missed there, that my hand would swell up, and it can be kind of a bad sort of thing. But I remember at that moment, she was upset because she missed the vein, and I remember looking at her, and again, I don't know where these words came from because I can't even believe I said it. I said to her, "I'm glad you're here. Thank you for being here." And she looked at me like I was some kind of nut, right? And and I could see she had this look on her face like well, you're crazy. I said, "No." I said, I'm serious. I said, "Right now, see, I can't start my own IV. And I'm grateful that you're here to do that." And as soon as I said that, her whole demeanor changed. You could see her relax, her shoulders dropped, her facial features softened, and she then proceeded to put an IV the size of a garden hose in my antecubital space, in my elbow here, without any difficulty, and uh, and that IV worked for a long time. Um, and so then I remember sitting there, and remember thinking, my friend, very competent ER doctor, was there, and I remember thinking, I appreciate that Chuck is here. He's competent. He knows what he's doing. I feel comfortable in his care. I appreciate that. I'm grateful for that. The nurses, and I knew many of the nurses, and I'm grateful for them and their competence and knowing how to deal with these situations. And then at that moment, and all the technology, I was hooked up to all these machines and such, and I remember there was an IV running. I was grateful for the IV and the bag, and the plastic that makes the bag, and the IV tubing and the needles, right? And even though I'm sort of not a pharmaceutical kind of guy, I was grateful for the pharmaceuticals. And at that moment, I see this pharmacy tech running from the pharmacy. She's running to the ER with this vial of this fibrinolytic agent, this blood clot dissolving drug. And I remember feeling an incredible gratitude for this girl, because she was, running to bring this. And we always talk about time is muscle. The sooner as you can get the blood vessel open, the sooner you limit the muscle damage. And she probably would have been running for anyone that was in the ER, but at that moment she was running for me, and I appreciated that. I was grateful for that. And I remember laying on this bed, and the bed was, was this gurney. It was incredibly uncomfortable, but I remember, you can do all the things you need to in those things. And I remember being grateful for that gurney. And then they gave me the thrombolytic agent, and now the blood clot dissolving drug usually works about half the time in about 90 minutes. 90 minutes, a long time when you're having this kind of heart attack. Um, the drug opened up my artery about 19 minutes after they gave it to me, which is pretty quick. In fact, it's ridiculously quick. Of course, I was grateful for the drug. Now, I have no idea. It may have opened up at 19 minutes, even if I wasn't doing gratitude, right? But the fact is that it worked, and it worked incredibly quick. And the pain, and when it works, because the pain relief is instantaneous, and you get these what we call reperfusion arrhythmias, kind of dangerous arrhythmias. But anyway, there was some of that, and then it calmed down, and I was grateful. Talk about great, the pain was gone, and I was incredibly grateful. And then CareLink got there, and they were able to get there in the snow. And then and I knew them, and the the nurses and stuff that were in there. And they got me in the truck, and it was a brand new truck, and I had never seen it. And I was grateful for the truck and the tires on the truck, and I was grateful for the people. And we drove to Cone, and I got to Cone, and I already knew this part, but one of my ex partners, who was the probably had one of the most, had one of the most experienced guys in dealing with these situations, probably in the country, dealing with the situation of putting a stent in, an artery while a heart attack's going on. Back in those days, it was a big deal. And Bruce was on call, and he was on call once a month, and he just happened to be on call that night. Maybe coincidence. So as I lay there, I remember, I was laying there shivering. I was cold, and I remember one of the nurses getting one of the blankets out from the blanket warmer and putting the blanket on me, and I was so grateful for that warm blanket. And I was grateful that Bruce was there, and that he was very competent, and all the nurses and their competence, and the medicines, and the wires that they used to do the catheters, and the wires are very sophisticated, and the balloon to open up the artery, and the stent and everything. And sure enough, there was the artery was blocked. It had been closed off. You could see it had opened up, and it was still mostly closed off. And he was able to open up that vessel, and he measured my ejection fraction. You fill the heart with blood and measure the ejection fraction. My ejection fraction was about 10 or 15%. It's horrible. And he told my family, I don't know what's going to happen. This is like massive. It's as big a heart attack as you can see, and still people survive. There was only one small area, essentially the posterior wall, that was moving, and nothing else was moving. And scary. And so I remember then going to the intensive care, the CCU, and laying there and and being grateful for the nurses and the CCU and all that technology and all the such. And I continued practicing that gratitude throughout that hospital stay. Now, normally, as Bruce had told my family, and I knew I dealt with this, professionally. And I was on the other side, but you have to get through all the complications of this as you sort of kind of wait to see what kind of recovery you have. And you have, heart failure, and you have these arrhythmia problems, and you have all sorts of issues that happen. And they're usually long hospital stays, and you hope you make it, and then you got to see what you're left with. Where you're left with a 10 or 15% ejection fraction, where you're like heart transplant candidate, or do you get enough recovery where you just don't know. And I ended up being in the hospital 4 days. I didn't have any heart failure. I didn't have any arrhythmias. I didn't have anything negative really happen to me. And they measured my ejection fraction before I left with an echocardiogram, and it was about 10-15%. It was terrible. And I was hoping, for you can get improvement later on. And so I left, and I was wondering how I was going to, pay my bills, because, I was the only one working in the office when we had other practitioners, but I brought in 90% of the income. And when I wasn't there was no income generation, right? There was no income coming in. And I knew I had to be out probably 6 weeks. And I didn't know, I couldn't pay the bills when I was working. I was going to pay them over this next 6 weeks. Those things go through your mind, but I continued with the gratitude. And the bank, worked with us, and our landlord worked with us and such. And anyway, I went back to work part time, small time, sort of 3 weeks, 3 weeks later, and then slowly built it up. And today my ejection fraction is about 50%. And 2 years ago, I think it was 2 years ago, I went skiing in Vail at about 10,000 feet, and had never skied before, and was learning to ski. And one of the things they make you do, after you learn how to put on your skis, is learn to walk up sideways up the mountain, to get up. Anyway, it's an incredible amount of work, and I was able to do that at 10,000, almost 11,000 feet. And that lady looked at me like I was a weirdo. She was like, I've never seen anyone, up here that's always smiling. I said, well, I said, if you only knew, is all I said. Um, I think she understood. But um, I I don't know what would have happened had I not done gratitude during that whole time, not found a way to be grateful for everything around me. However, I do know that it put me in a better place mentally and emotionally. All that stuff we talked about at the very first talk, all that adrenaline and all that stuff that causes blood pressure to go up and heart rate to go up, all that negative stuff wasn't happening, or it was happening less. And that's a good thing. Physiologically, that's a good thing, right? Also, I put everyone around me at ease. Any nurses that are on, there's some nurses that are on the call, and nurses that are on the call understand that when a doctor comes in, like all the nurses run the other, they like turn their back and run the other direction because doctors make the worst patients, right? We're demanding and we're um, ornery, and mostly because we're scared, I think. But anyway, I got the best nurses, and they took great care of me, and I was incredibly grateful. So I don't know what would have happened, but I do know that it put everyone around me, made everyone comfortable. It made me comfortable. It all those bad physiologic things didn't happen. So I think it had a powerful effect. I can't say how much of an effect, um, but I'm grateful. And so um, fast forward in 2 years, then my wife developed breast cancer, and it had spread, and she had 13 out of 14 positive lymph nodes, and they said they couldn't do surgery because she had all this lymph node involvement. And I knew she wasn't didn't really want chemo, but we knew that really wasn't any other choice at that point, and so surgery wasn't even an option, and so I said, "How do you do?" I knew the gratitude was going to be important. I said, "How do you do gratitude? It's hard enough to do it, when you're having a heart attack, but at least there, like while I was going through it, it was one time, and then I slowly kind of get better, and so you can feel pretty good, but about what you're doing. But how do you do gratitude when you're getting chemotherapy? And because she had so much involvement, because it was a very aggressive cancer, she was going to get this triple chemotherapy regimen, three different drugs, and since she was going to lose her hair, she was going to feel terrible and all this kind of stuff. How do you do gratitude when you're feeling worse and worse, every week, and still find the things to be grateful for? So I came up with this idea of a gratitude recording, an exercise. And so I recorded this relaxation, and then this uh, exercise where it took her through. Started with her physician, and I was very specific in that original recording with his name and things like that, and appreciate his knowledge and his training and knowing how to deal with these and the diagnose things and things like that. Then the nurses and their training and their ability to start IVs and to take care of all the things that they need to take care of. Even the volunteers that are incredibly helpful. All the technology, the CT scans and PET scans and MRI scanners and all of that great stuff. I remember when she was getting radiation therapy is this big, scary looking machine. And, sort of metaphorically said that, hug the machine, so to speak, and be grateful for it, let it do the things it needs to do. And so, and then took her through all of that, through the facility and through all the technology, all the way to the chemotherapy drug. And then got to the thing, chemotherapy drug, and basically let it come into your body in a positive sort of way, not thinking positive, but in a grateful way, and allow it to go and do the things that it needs to do. That is to kill the cancer cells and to have less effect or no effect on the other cells. Now, every time she went in, they said she would lose her hair after the first dose, or now at the second dose, and she never lost her hair. It got a little wonky, but she never lost her hair. And she did incredibly well. She had incredible results. The tumor shrunk faster than the oncologist or the surgeon had probably ever seen. They thought. Now, they thought it was related to the medicine she was getting, one new medicine called Herceptin, that you may have heard of. And they said it was all the medicine, and it may well have been. I have no clue. I'm not going to sit here and say it wasn't the medicine. But again, I think the gratitude allowed her, put her in a position to let the medicine do its thing. And maybe it kept it from not affecting the normal cells as much. I don't know. But if nothing else, it's interesting because in chemo patients, they get sick when they get their medicine. Well, someone noticed years ago that many chemotherapy patients started to get sick before they ever got their chemo. And they said, oh, that's because, they get nervous and they know what's coming. And so they kind of get sick before that. Well, it's actually more than that. They actually looked at a study and they started measuring people's white blood counts the day before their chemo. So, and then the day before, and then before they left for the doctor's office, hospital, wherever they were getting it. And then when they were sitting in the lobby, they measured it again. And then just before they were getting their chemo, they measured it again. And then, of course, after. And it turns out that the white blood count starts going down before you ever leave the house to get your chemotherapy, which I think is absolutely fascinating because you haven't even gotten your chemo yet. We're not talking about nausea. We're talking about the effects of chemotherapy. Chemotherapy lowers your white blood count, and that effect was happening before you ever got your chemo. So very powerful things. And so people would get, like I said, get sick when they're sitting in the waiting room. That kind of stuff never happened to her, And so she would listen to this recording every time she got chemo. I would encourage her to listen to it every day, and she certainly didn't do that. But listen to it at least while she was getting her chemo, and have headphones on and things like that. Because what can happen is as you're getting your chemo, your thoughts can run away with you, right? You're laying there, all of a sudden you get maybe back pain, and because you've been laying for so long, and you go to move, and you're like, oh God, that hurts or whatever, and then you think, oh, you know, breast cancer can go to the back and can metastasize to the back, and you get back pain, and maybe I've got a met to my back, and that's what's causing the pain, and if it's in my back, it's probably everywhere else, and maybe it's already spread, or maybe it's all over my body, and these thoughts just run away, right? And so what meditation does, but it's hard to meditate because most of us don't do that. But what the recording was able to do with the recording is you can stop that runaway thought and bring it back to something. And the something is find something to be grateful for. So that's all great stuff, right? The issue is that what I learned over time was that I could, if I was feeling bad, I don't care what it was, if I was in this miserable state, when I was ready to get out of it, I could basically, I had a tool that I could find one thing to be grateful for and my misery would lessen. And then I could find another thing to be grateful for and it would lessen some more. And then I could keep doing that. The weird thing is that often I would sit there in my misery and I would say, okay, I'm tired of this. I need to get out of this. I need to find something to be grateful for. Okay, so let me find something. What am I going to be grateful for? Because there's so much, and I can't think of anything right now. And okay, go ahead. Find one thing, just one thing. What might that one thing be? Geez, I don't know. I can't think of anything. But in doing that and asking myself what the heck I was doing, what I came to really find out was what I was really saying is I don't want to find something to be grateful for because I know if I do that, my misery would lessen. And I don't want it to lessen. I want to sit in my misery and be miserable. Now, to me, at that moment in time, that's when I decided I must be insane because only an insane person would do that. That's what I thought. What sane person would be miserable and have a tool that would work miraculously, instantaneously to lessen the misery and choose not to use it because you wanted to stay miserable? That was insane to me. I didn't understand all this then. What I didn't understand at that time was that I was choosing that I felt this overwhelming amount of self-hatred, this overwhelming amount of unworthiness. That was so overwhelming that I didn't think I deserved to feel better. I thought I deserved to stay and feel miserable. I wasn't even good enough, to to experience anything but this misery. And that, to me, at that time was nuts. Today, I understand that. Today, so what I was doing back then was trying to change it, right? I was trying to take that misery and find this tool that would lessen the misery. What I wasn't doing was bringing in the compassion and the self compassion to love that self hatred, that part of me that I hated. And that's the limitation of gratitude. It is a tool that's absolutely useful. Okay, it will take you from being in the bottom of that hole, and it will instantly transport you out of that hole, whether it's through some magic tunnel or whatever. All of a sudden, you're out of the hole, standing on the ground. But you still have this chain that is strapped to your ankle that leads to the bottom of that hole. Now, that chain, you can walk around as far as you want. The chain's as long as you want it to be, right? But at any moment, right, it will suck you back down. You will be at the bottom of that hole again in an instant. So the gratitude doesn't get to the foundation of your misery, of your self-hatred, of your unworthiness. It doesn't do anything for that. It's sort of like a pill, in all honesty, right? A pill, if you have a headache, will help the headache. It doesn't get to the cure of the headache. It doesn't get to the foundation of the headache. It doesn't, it's just you don't feel it as much, right? So it's much like that. So it has incredible usefulness, but it has its limitations. For me, I had to get to that next stage. I had to understand, that where this was coming from, so that I could realize that I was not insane. I was anything but. What I had is incredible amount of self-hatred and such. And that was the issue. And so that's where, again, while I used gratitude for years and it's very useful, again, it had that limitation that um, that it kept me stuck there because I kept trying to change that imposter syndrome, the self-hatred, the unworthiness. I kept trying to change that instead of love that. In other words, once you find that compassion, then everything can change. But nothing's going to change in my mind until you find that that self-compassion, that acceptance. I was going to say love, but again, that love is so ambiguous, but that's self-acceptance. It doesn't mean that you can't come out of it. It doesn't mean that you can't change. It doesn't mean you can't grow. I talked about this, so many people say, well, you say, oh, the self-acceptance, it means I'm going to stay the way I am all the time. It has nothing to do with that. There's nothing wrong with growth. There's nothing wrong with changing. There's nothing wrong with improving. There's nothing wrong with any of that. It's that none of that, but the problem is none of that's going to make you happy. None of that is going to get rid of your misery. That growth, that self-improvement isn't going to get you anywhere without the self-acceptance. But if you find that happiness now, you find that, that self-acceptance where you are, then everything can change. That's the challenge. That's where the self-compassion comes in. That for me is the key. So again, that's how useful gratitude can be. I continue to do it. I continue to find it incredibly powerful and useful. And I encourage all of you to do it. But realize the limitations. It is a tool. It doesn't get to the foundation. And to get to the foundation, you've got to look at it. You've got to be self-aware. You have to be open to looking at this. This is just simple as that. If you're not open if you're not open to looking at it, then you won't be aware of it. And if you're not, you can't change anything if you're not aware of it. You can't accept anything if you're not aware of it. That's the key. I hope that makes sense. Okay. It makes sense to me. I guess in the end, that's all that matters. So, any questions, any concerns, any anything, type them in the question and answer box or the chat box. Clear as mud. It's clear is obvious. Thank you for the nice, kind comments. But as far as questions, any questions? Okay, while you think of that, um, so again, what I think uh, we'll do this. This may be the last webinar. I told the last group that it was, but perhaps um, as I think about it more, I think there are exercises that I can come up with that that will be useful. The question is how to do it, and um, again, this is an experiment. So I will see what I can do, see what I can come up with. Let's. I've got all of your emails, so I will let you know. But this is um, middle of March, so we'll think about maybe the middle of April or so um, to have another session, and we might have it anyway, even if I don't come up with the exercise. I always can come up with other things to discuss. I do want to do another webinar on the biology of belief, which is another one of my very favorite topics. Um, and and I used to give some talks on that and do some seminars on that, and I haven't done it in a long time. The other thing is I've considered doing something live again, maybe a weekend type thing. Julie Milinek, who runs the Natural Triad magazine, owns and publishes that. She has always been very kind to sponsor some of these things. Um, there's a place called the River House in the mountains of North Carolina. She has a friend who owns that. Actually, Julie lives there right now, but it's a um, it's several. It's sort of a bed and breakfast. It's a big house, but then they've got several other. It's set in a very rural kind of area. There's many buildings, and I think it can house maybe 20 people in all these buildings and such. Um, and there's obviously separate rooms. In the house, there's a couple bedrooms. It's sort of a bed and breakfast area, and it's quite nice. Anyway, we've done it there. We've had 12 or 13 people, if I remember. Maybe we could go up to 15. So that's one consideration. Um, I would just need basically to charge to cover the expenses of using the place, and then you would have to, fund your own um, room, but they would include food, I think, there. There's another place not too far from me called Primland, Primland. It's about 45 minutes from me. It's about, I guess it'll be about an hour and a half, maybe from Greensboro. It's beautiful there. It's very resort-like, a big area, I don't know, 1,000 acres or something. Um, it's very nice, and um, that would that might be a little more expensive, um, but would be fun. I've never actually stayed there, but you can look it up. It's quite nice. Um, so, not a question, but I wonder if you're aware of Dr. David Hanscom, a spine surgeon in the state of Washington, who wrote the book Back in Control, Direct Your Own Care, in which he deals with chronic pain using some of the techniques, exercises you speak of. Yeah, he should go on the road together. Yes. So there are a few of us out there. There's another guy whose name is John Sarno. He wrote a book called Healing Back Pain. He's in Rochester, New York, um, and he is a little bit different. And there's another. Anyway, there's a few of us that are out there. It's unusual to have a spine surgeon or any kind of surgeon. Of course, Bernie Siegel was a pioneer in this, and he was a general surgeon and cancer surgeon. Um, but it's unusual for a surgeon because to do this because they're so physically focused. But I think there are a few surgeons who are aware enough that, especially spine surgeons, who have learned that what they find, as we talked about at one point, what we find physically doesn't always correlate with people's symptoms. And just because you go and fix that thing, you go fix the disc or whatever, people's pain doesn't necessarily go away or get better. And there's more to it than that, right? So much pain, as I told you about, I would say 10% at most of illness, of pain, especially chronic issues, do we find a physical cause for. Most of the time, we never find a physical cause, and so it becomes really challenging to treat. Yet we've got good evidence now, as you said, with him and with others. Um, you know, um, uh, John Kabat-Zinn, who's at the University of Massachusetts, who's of course into mindfulness, and he started with chronic back pain patients and has expanded. Duke has an integrative center that does some of this stuff, and they all do it to different degrees. The ones that I find, the most challenging, are a lot. There's a lot of alternative practitioners who who say, they use sort of natural techniques, and many of them have just substituted the natural technique for a pharmaceutical. So they use supplements. They'll do blood tests to check, functional testing to find these low levels of whatever, and then they'll supplement it. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. But again, you're just sort of taking something external to you, to fix it. And what I'm saying is that you don't need anything external. Now, again, that doesn't mean when I'm laying there having a heart attack, right? I'm doing gratitude, but at the same time, I'm also getting thrombolytic drug, and I'm getting a stent to my left anterior descending coronary artery opened up, right? Um, so so I would never say, there's a place for all of it. If you've got a broken leg, I want someone to set my leg and put a cast on it. I don't want to do meditation or, you know, um, acupuncture, although acupuncture may help with the pain and stuff, right? If I have appendicitis, I probably want someone to take out my appendix. I don't want to have massage therapy, right? So there's a place for all of it. Um, I don't have an issue with taking an antidepressant if you're depressed, but at the same time, it's naive to think that all you have to do is take that antidepressant. From my standpoint, you need to be doing other things as well so that you can get to the root of why you may have this chemical imbalance. What caused it to begin with, like we talked about in the very first talk. If you want any of the recordings, I think I'm going to end up putting most of them on YouTube, in a private sort of way. So if you want those, I can send you the link and you can access them that way. I think that's what seems to be working best. Some people had trouble with the Dropbox or downloading these large files. That works. The cancer gratitude exercise, the chemotherapy exercise, I've also put on YouTube, and you can just search with my name and cancer gratitude or something like that, and it should come up. Gratefully Well was the name of the company I came up with. That was originally spelled GREAT, gratefully well .com. I changed it to the normal spelling, but on the YouTube it may still be under the old thing, at least from the search standpoint. So if you have anyone with uh, chemotherapy and they want to listen to that, they can do it that way. There's three parts. One's an introduction that you only need to listen to once. Then there's a relaxation exercise and the chemotherapy exercise. Um, it was sort of in my very, very early days of doing voiceover work. I could do it better today, but but it's still effective. But if you want a copy of listen to any of these recordings from the webinar, let me know and I'll send you the link, the YouTube link, so you can access the private um, recording. Any other questions? Very good. Well, it was incredibly enjoyable. Thank you all. We had, I continued to have sort of strong, what I considered strong attendance. We had somewhere around 40 people on average between the two, the Sunday and Tuesday groups. I appreciate you all tuning in and listening to help me try to develop this, and I will continue to try to develop it more and more. If you have any issues and you need help with any of this stuff, feel free to email me, reach out. I'll do anything that I can. I'm in the process of writing a book, so my time is a little bit limited. But for me, this is a passion. It's not work. Um, so time sometimes does get short, but seems like I always find time to do the things I want to do. So, um, so thank you once again, and have a good night. And let me know if there's something I can do. And otherwise, I will be letting you know in the next month or so if we have another session and if I can come up with some exercises for you. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.